Chapter 14. At home. In the kitchen, Stephen played his mind against itself, diverting it from the slaughter room obscenity with small domestic actions. And then the deception of these actions became too obvious, ricocheting back into curtains of blood and streams of semen splashing from jagged cowhide holes. He drifted in the kitchen, blank-faced, picking up plates and wiping them, putting them down, wiping them again, polishing cutlery against the side of his leg. Somewhere at the back of the flat, the hag beast made dim shunting shouts as she moved about, but Stephen didn't hear them. The killing of the afternoon was stored inside him, weighted by the heavier following torture, but he was afraid to examine it, afraid to search for its effects. That part of his brain was temporarily locked, and he was afraid of what he was going to do now with these plates and forks and spoons. This was the beginning he had wished for, but never expected to see. Tonight, the beast would eat the first of the meals that would send her down to hell. But if he failed, if he hesitated or was weak, then she would rise like a gorgon and split him open. He had planned, on the bus the morning before Cripps's horror show, to use some disguised ingredient subtle enough to escape detection and of a borderline virulence that would eventually destroy her but allow him, sanctioned by youth, to recover. But now, as he squatted in front of the cupboard under the sink, staring at ancient and unused bottles of disinfectant, bleach, and drain cleaner, trying to choose between them, he felt a sudden wild boldness flood his guts. Subtlety was pointless. She would eat whatever he did. She had to. Her hate for him would not allow her to refuse the challenge. He took 2 empty plates into the bathroom. It was dark when the hag beast galleoned into the kitchen. The bare overhead bulb cut hard shadows into the sheets of newspaper tinted over the plates on the table. Stephen was seated and waiting.
So we have a new cook. What'd you cook, Stephen? Uncover it. Let's see if you can match your mother.
Stephen drew away the paper and watched the tight compression of her smile, the narrowing of her eyes. On the plate, equally portioned, 2 curving lengths of shit lay dark against veined china.
It won't work, Stephen. You think you're so alien to my system?
It won't work. Stephen went cold. She knew what he was trying to do. But she was pulling her plate toward her, pressing her fork into the softness of the stool, lifting a piece into her mouth. Okay, we're just going to take a quick little second here. I want to accentuate the point that when I was talking about how gross this book was, and I remember it years later, it's this part that does it. This is what sticks out of my mind. The taste and the consistency of the shit in your own mouth. I also want to accentuate the point that this book just gets weirder and more fucking gross from here. So I just hope you are enjoying it so far, if anybody's actually still here. The cow rape scene was especially fun, as well as Cripps's voice. And here we go. Moving on. Enjoy. Her eyes in their mean folds of fat held his, and for a second the stink of shit absorbed time. Between them, space emptied of all the mists that usually swirled there, and Stephen saw how well she understood him. Then she moved, and the stink was just stink again, and Stephen had to carry on, whatever she knew. He saw thin fibers and lumps of still recognizable food poking from the broken end of the shit, and prayed that her destruction would be swift. The hag beast waited for him to eat first. He put a section of the shit into his mouth. It rubbed his lips, and the chocolate-smeared drag of its entry made him shudder. He could not immediately bring his teeth together, and the turd lay acridly in the hollow of his tongue, forcing its thick, boggy smell up behind his nose and into his head, cinching his stomach in a rapid serial spasm that threatened to send bile squirting from his nostrils. He forced himself to bite down and chew quickly, but speed didn't reduce the appalling foulness of the taste. The shit was gritty against the roof of his mouth and made crunching sounds with his teeth. It worked itself into a clogging paste that built up under his tongue and inside his cheeks, so stiff that he had to use his finger to hook it out. He felt he was drowning in the anus of some dysentery-struck mammal. Vistas of the world made shit opened before him. Then, at last, a small amount of vomit punched through his locked throat and mercifully allowed him to swallow. He bent forward and gripped the legs of the table, screwing his eyes shut. Thin brown liquid ran from the corners of his clamped mouth, and he jerked quickly on his chair, up and down, fighting his stomach, willing it to accept the returning waste. Somehow he kept it down, and when he looked at the hag beast again, her smirk had faded. It was her turn. Shit in her mouth made her twist her head in a spastic half circle and pump her neck into a tightly stretched red bag, like some obscene mating bird. The force of her first retch blew snot into the air, but it didn't part her lips. She lurched against the table, then steadied herself with weak arms while her belly shook. Bunching raw muscles showed through the loose skin of her jowls, and the sound of grinding teeth made Stephen press his thighs together. How she must be damaging herself to compete with him. Then she couldn't hold it any longer and puked onto her plate in a screeching, explosive torrent that spattered the front of Stephen's shirt. She heaved a few more times until it came up dry, then sat, arms rigid to the edge of the table, shivering and silent, drawing breath. Stephen felt dismay creep into his already churning guts. If the hag beast could not master a plate of shit, how could he fill her with enough poison to kill her? He saw his plans crumbling and was about to speak some desperate, goading remark when her arms relaxed and she began to function again. She cut a piece of shit with the edge of her fork, speared it, put it in her mouth, and swallowed. Her movements were deliberate, machine-like. She cut another piece of shit and ate it. Small tremors rippled across her breasts and shoulders, but they did not touch her throat. She looked at him and smiled ingenuously.
Stephen, I can't keep eating without you.
He slid his fork into the thing on his plate, thankful that it had escaped most of her vomit. Her own plate dripped, the shat swam in it, and entered again the body rebellion of his first mouthful, and kept forcing it in.
How is it?
He did not look at her as he spoke.
It smells like your burp. I didn't expect this from you, Stephen. You started a game with your darling mother, haven't you? Those years in your room with that fucking mongrel and your precious TV doing nothing but wanking and picking pus out of your face, and you think you could just crawl up and wipe off the slime? Just reach into your box of dreams and slip one on like a coat? You sorry fuck. You're not strong enough to do it.
I think I'm getting stronger, Mama. The hag beast laughed and opened her mouth in mock surprise. Stephen saw bits of shit stuck to her teeth.
Strong? You were born a runt and you haven't changed. How strong are you getting? Come on, show me.
She finished the last nugget of shit and smashed her plate against the table.
Get out of that chair and stand up. Mama wants to see how strong you are.
Her bellow hit the dead walls of the kitchen and came back at Stephen in a rolling chain of thuds, each one pushing him further upright until he stood, arms limp at his sides, waiting for the coming humiliation. God, if he could be like Cripps just for 1 minute. The hag beast moved close to him, and their breaths combined in a sluggish cloud of shit and saliva. He was too close. He shut his eyes. He felt her fat fingers undressing him. His cells screamed, but his arms were too weak to fling her from him. Too weak to force her mouth apart until her jaws snapped. Too weak to yank her head down so sharply that the spine broke a few vertebrae from the skull and stuck out into the air through the skin at the back of her neck. Too weak to enact 1,000 killings wished 1,000 times. He had spoken too soon. He was naked.
Look, Stephen.
She hit his face.
Look at yourself.
Stephen looked down and saw what had always been there. Soft white skin over bones, ribs, dick hanging. She laughed, prodding his chest and stomach, lifting his balls to look underneath.
I don't see it, Stephen. Where's this strength of yours?
He stood mute. She was too powerful for him to survive direct and active confrontation. The hag beast reached down and pulled her dress over her head. She wore nothing underneath, and the sharpness of her crotch burned his throat.
Are you as strong as this?
She slapped her dimpled saddlebag hips, ran her hands over rolls of hard fat stacked from groin to breast. Stephen looked at her matted gray cunt and the blood sticking in clots to the inside of her thighs.
Look at this mountain of flesh, Stephen. Throw yourself against it. Have you ever calculated its weight? This is strength, you whining bucket of piss. This is what you must measure yourself against. It stands between you and everything you want, and you'll never get past it.
Stephen knew she was wrong, and he wanted to spit it in her face. Lucy was going to open up like a tunnel, and he would crawl through her into a world impossible for the hag beast to touch. But it was still too early to strut this before Mama. She could still destroy it at a stroke. So he stayed quiet through her ranting. Later, in his room, the shit in his belly made him sick, and he lay curled around Dog on the floor by the bed. Dog licked sweat from his master's forehead and whimpered at his shiverings. Stephen felt the animal's nuzzlings through the gauze of his pain and dreamed he was somewhere underground with the velvet lips of a cow against his neck. In his fever, he merged with it, knowing its thoughts, its fears, and the timeless species' desire for a place where men never came. At dawn, he was able to rise, pale and drained, and Dog yelped with joy and gave thanks to Dog God that there was still something left to love. In the hall, as he left the flat, splashes of the hag beast's vomit bloomed on the floor from the kitchen to her room like flowers of hope. Stephen felt good when he saw them. Chapter 14.